Good morning.
Morning.
Okay, we've been working with handout on the English translations of the Bible, leading up to the King James Version. So, I don't know. You all realize that there were English translations prior to the King James, and we worked at that. In fact, we've gone through this handout with all the translations except for King James. I'm going to finish this handout this morning and move on to next topic, English translation. I'll talk about that in a minute. But what do you remember from what we've talked about? Some of the takeaways is one takeaway was that the early church started with the Greek translation. They were working with the Greek. Then when we get into the early Middle Ages, the 4th century, going into the end of the 4th century, going into the 5th century, the church adopted the Latin translation of the Bible, and they used that up until the toward the end of the Middle Ages. And toward the end of the Middle Ages, we're looking about 1300s, late 1300s. There began to be an interest in even having access to the Bible, because when the church was using the Latin translation, that was the translation of the educated. It was used for international commerce. It was used for science. It was used for theology and the clergy. So with the translation, the Bible being translated into Latin, that, among other things, it allowed the clergy to control how the Bible was used and how the Bible was interpreted. So we've talked about that. And along with that, they highly discouraged other translations. Like if you were in Germany, they discouraged coming up with the German translation. They discouraged coming up with an English translation. And there are people, especially when the printing press was invented and was printing things, people say, hey, we could have access to the text. We could have access to the Bible. And so there was a push between some of the church leaders and some of the other church leaders who were saying that. Some church leaders were in favor of it. And then, of course, the average person was in favor of it too. So that's when we started having English translations, at least in England. At first, the translations were translated from the Latin. That was the Wycliffe Bible. First translation, first full English translation from the Latin. And then Tyndale, once we get to the Reformation period, he was working with the original, the Greek. So he was able to translate the whole New Testament from Greek to English. He didn't really do much with the Old Testament. He did some, but he was executed before he could, finish his work there. And then we had some other translations from the Latin. Probably a very significant translation would have been the Geneva Bible, where it was the first translation you had from the original languages, from to English, from the Old Testament and Hebrew from English, the New Testament from Greek. That was your first one, and that really did set the stage for the King James Version, because there's all these translations that were being worked on, and are we going to translate from the Latin, or are we going to go all the way back to the Hebrew and the Greek manuscripts we have available? This all set the stage for the King James Version. And, after the King James Version, there weren't many translations that really held sway for many years. Um, And so, what do you know about the King James Version?
I've been told that Paul spoke the King James English.
Yeah, I've heard that too. What's all this talk about Greek and Hebrew? You know, what about the King James? That's the first one. And, you know, to pick up on Joe's point, the King James wasn't the first English translation. I don't know why I went through that brief history, and there were I just nice to scratch the surface on that. There were a lot of people who were translating. Maybe they translated the gospel or four gospels. But a lot of people were dabbling in English translations if they could get access to a Latin translation, or better yet, to Hebrew and Greek manuscripts. So,
What was the connection with King James? He was a king, so he got his name on it, or did he request that there be a translation?
well, here's in England there was dissatisfaction from leaders there about the Geneva Bible, because remember John Calvin, he was a Swiss reformer. The Geneva Bible was put together and was translated from the Hebrew and the Greek in Geneva, Switzerland. And John Calvin actually did have some influence there. And so there were in 1604, religious leaders in England approached King James. And they wanted it to be authorized by the king, because even though the Church of England theologically was fairly close to, in some ways, to the Catholic Church, you know, once the Reformation went or came into play, in England, the religious leaders and the kings were okay with an English translation. They were okay with the Bible being in the hands of the everyday people. So in 1604, religious leaders approached King James for a new English translation. It's time, and as I said, they had learned from some of the other efforts. So this was a very organized translation, a very organized effort. 1604, finished in 1611. The translation project consisted of 54 scholars, and the translators were divided into 6 teams, and each team was responsible for translating a section of the Bible. And as you know, as I said, they translated from the original languages, from the Hebrew and Greek, like the Geneva Bible did. And this version gained popularity very quickly. Became the Bible of choice to be read in the church and to be read at home. And then we've hinted at it, but from 1611 to about 1769, there were a number of revisions. They were trying to get this right. And then up to 1769, that was your last revision, last major revision of the King James. And then from then on, most King James Bibles after that were not from 1611, but they were from 1769 because of the numerous revisions. And Joe, you're agreeing with that?
Yeah, because I have the 1611, not in black letter, but in Roman letters. And there are vowel changes that happened in the English language after 1611.
Yep.
Spelling differences. So it's really interesting to look at the actual 1611 wording. It takes a while to get your brain geared to the differences.
Compare that to the 1769. So, I'm going to say that, for its time, the King James Version was certainly a masterpiece. And it's still a good translation. It was a word for word translation, so they were really, they emphasized and they worked real hard at giving you a word for word translation, trying to preserve the grammar of the Hebrew and Greek as much as possible. So when I'm reading the Hebrew and Greek at home, and I come to a verse and I'm not quite sure how to translate it, I translate it the best I can. But often I'll go to the King James first because that is a word for word translation. I want to see what they did with this because there might be a word I'm not quite sure how to transfer or translate, or there might be a grammatical phrase, maybe a phrase of 2 or 3 words, and grammatically, I'm just not quite sure how to put those together. It just doesn't make sense. And then I might read the King James and it's clear, it didn't make sense to that either. And it could be one of those phrases that it's just very difficult to translate either from Hebrew, Greek, King James. So, it's still a good translation in a number of ways. In 2011, I went to Princeton University on a Saturday. They were having, I think, the 400th anniversary of the King James, and people we talked about. Well, we have all these newer translations, and the King James is hard to read, and that kind of thing. And this was a really good seminar by the biblical scholars at Princeton. Thank you, Craig, for having her, and we apologize, Mary Jane, for not bringing you in sooner. And it was just a good seminar to say, okay, many churches don't work with the King James anymore, but boy, it had its place and it had its contribution in history. And one of the reasons that it was harder to read was because it was a choppy translation. Because of trying to preserve the Hebrew and Greek grammar might be helpful for someone who is into translations and things, but for the average person, this reads very awkward. So I don't know, in the late, early 19th century and on to the mid 19th century, or into the mid 20th century and onward, then we had an influx of translations. But prior to that, over time, King James did become less popular because we discovered, I'm talking about world, there were discovered a number of Hebrew and Greek manuscripts, a number of biblical manuscripts that predated the manuscripts that translators of King James Version were using. So, and some of these and they were earlier, and some of these earlier manuscripts were exposing some errors or were giving us some new information about the Greek and Hebrew that the King James translators didn't have access to. So, and then that's why you did have more translations. The newer translations are taking advantage of the older manuscripts and some of the newer translations or the newer information we've gathered.
Growing up in Sunday school,
Yeah,
the verses we memorized were King James, and I've heard people say already, well, problem with other translations is they aren't easy to memorize like the King James. Now, that's probably just because exposed, that's what we were exposed to. But if I remember a verse, it's because it's King James.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Well, there are several aspects of that. One is if you're working with one translation, there's no question.
Yeah.
But if you want to memorize verses, and we still do that in the Sunday school classes, what translation are you going to use? And so what we have in a lot of churches, kind of choose a translation. I'm not sure we have chosen a translation. We have the NIV and the Pew. And one of the reasons for that is that's more readable than maybe the New Revised Standard Version or the Revised Standard Version, whenever that was chosen. I don't know if anyone here knows the history of the church as to why we have the New International Version in the pews as opposed to another translation. But that's what we have, and then up front, we have, the pastors might, they might use the Message, they might use the Common English Bible, they use the New Revised Standard Updated Version, and sometimes I'll pull out the NIV just to see how all that compares. So that's one.
Well, and some of those versions weren't available when we were kids.
Yeah.
Which was a little.
And the other thing, even though the King James is choppy, especially when you get to the Psalms, it's very poetic.
That's a rhythm.
Yeah, it has a rhythm, it has a life of its own. So when you look at some of the newer translations, they may take out the these and the thous, but they may stick to some of the original language of the King James, and then they might footnote it, or they might add. They say, okay, we're going to translate this different, and then they might footnote, and we're going to get into that. We're going to deal with Psalm 23 in a minute, and look at, because Psalm 23, it just has that flavor to it, and we'll look at the footnotes. But some people were very reluctant to give up on some of that poetic language. So those are two things about the having different translations.
One of the interesting things about the particular phrasing in the King James Bible, so much of it goes back to Tyndale's phrasing. And one person who studied this, I think about 80% of the phrasing is directly traceable back to Tyndale.
Is that right?
Used by those following Tyndales.
And that would be the New Testament, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not so much the Old Testament, because I don't think Tyndale even translated the Psalms.
No,
Translated as far as I know, the first 5 books of the Bible, and then
one of the prophets.
and Jonah. And then he may have translated more. Valley.
You said so when the older manuscripts were found, that's when they started making other versions. When was that? Like what year?
Well, in the late 1800s or the late 20th century, we did have, I'm trying to think.
West Cotton Court.
What's that?
West Cotton Court's Greek
Okay.
text used some of the newer manuscripts that have been found. And the British Revised Version of the late 1880s was based on West Cotton Court. And in the United States, the 1901 American Standard Version was also based on West Cotton Court.
Okay, yeah, that is helpful. And then in about 47, we had the discovery of the
1947? Is that?
1847, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that gave us a lot of information. In fact, especially now we didn't have I think those you're more in tune with the New Testament on all this. I'm more in tune with the Old Testament. So this is a good compliment here. So because the Dead Sea Scrolls, there were no New Testament manuscripts discovered in, but that just about almost every book we in the Old Testament that came out of Dead Sea Scrolls, and it was a place called Qumran. They had about 11 caves or so, and that's where they stored some of the older manuscripts. And what else was I going to say on that? Well, that just gave us a lot more information. And one thing it taught us, because the Old Testament really was working with a 9th century CE manuscript. And when we looked at the Dead Sea Scrolls, it told us that that manuscript was a pretty reliable manuscript, even though it was late. But now, look at the footnotes, they might refer you to Qumran or to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Especially if we come to a Hebrew word we don't understand, and then we look at the what the Hebrew and the Dead Sea Scrolls is, that might give us a bit more insight. And we know these were much earlier, so that's important.
Who was the ones like was making these newer versions? Like I know it was like the church and like England, but like in 1947, like who was like, I'm gonna make a new international version and like those things.
Those came later, didn't they, in the 70s?
Okay.
If that's too off topic, you don't have to answer it.
No, Joe's gonna help us with it. 1901.
1901 was the American Standard Version. And that was where the American scholars could agree with British scholars in the updated translation, the King James Version, they were doing in England in the late 1880s. And we had to wait X number of years after the revised version was published before the Americans could publish their version of it. That the big number is 1901 ASB. And it's some say it's excellent Greeklish, as you were talking about, following the syntax and the order and
It was a word for word translation, and we'll get into that. We're not there yet. There's one thing I want to do before we look at the different kinds of translations that we do have when we start comparing all these. There's a word for word translation, a thought for thought translation, and then a balance between the two. And then we get the last on the other side of the extreme, it's paraphrase, and we will talk about that. I'm gonna jump to 1952.
well, they actually started this, I think they were doing the New Testament in mid-1940s National Council of Churches.
Yeah.
And what would become the Revised Standard.
So that was in 48, I think.
Yeah, they were in the 40, yeah, and then the whole thing came out and
Okay, the Revised Standard Version. Was in 1952. And that, in fact, the church I grew up in, the Wealthy Church of the Brethren in Smithburg, Maryland, we had this in our pews for a number of years. And then I went to seminary, and actually it was when I got out of seminary, and when I was in graduate school, the new Revised Standard Version came out in 1989. So that's the NRSV. Now, Joe mentioned the National Council of Churches. This was a project started by the National Council of Churches, and they had scholars work on this, and they worked with some publishing houses and again, what you had with the Revised Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version is a vast team of translators. You didn't have one person or a small group of people translating like you did with maybe the Wycliffe Bible and the Tyndale Bible. Now and we learned this from the Geneva Bible as well as from the King James Version. If you're gonna do this well, there's some disadvantages to it, but, you wanna get a number of linguists and biblical scholars together. And one might take one book or a section, another take another section, and they're working in teams. So they can, it's just not one person. And then you have editors that oversee it, and it's a long process. And then in 2023, it started in 2016, 2017. The National Council of Churches approached the Society of Biblical Literature and said, we feel we need an updated version. So they start pretty much with the new RSV, then we have a updated version. Updated edition, there you go. And that just came out. I got mine in 2024 and I've been bringing it to class, and I'm gonna explain a little bit more about that in a minute. But, this is one example of, now, each translation is going to have a history. There's the Jerusalem Bible that, Glenn uses, and then there's the New Jerusalem Bible. NIV, there, you've heard of the Living Bible, and then, someone came out with, which was a paraphrase, and then someone came out with the New Living Translation, which is not a paraphrase. It's actually a thought for thought translation, and it's a good translation, where the Living Bible was really a translation by one person, Kenneth Taylor, I want to think. And okay, my dad read the Living Bible before the New Living Translation came out, because he said, when I read the King James, even the Revised Standard Version, I'm not always sure what it means. And I read the Living Bible and it gives me a little bit more. And
The origin of the Living Bible was Kenneth Taylor's paraphrase of the American Standard Version of
Okay.
1991 for his children. And his friends liked it so much, they kept pestering him to get it published. He never intended that originally to be beyond the family.
yeah. But it took hold. I mean, and I know we had the Living Bible here, but it had that green cover. And when I would go to visit people, I could tell they dust off as a pastor, they dust off the coffee table, and they would put that nice green out of leather, whatever cover on the coffee table. Pastor's coming, so they put down the Living Bible. We'll go to Pat and then.
My original question, hasn't been answered yet, but
Okay.
I looked it up. Because NIV and NLT really became popular. So
Yeah.
I was wondering when, so 78 would be, you want to write national version?
Yeah, that sounds right.
And then 96 would be the NLT.
That's right, yeah. And so, think about 78, 96, and then there's some translations in there. Others that are in there, we're not going to hit them all. And it just became a time. Now, it's good to know this history because, okay, 52, 89, so English was changing from, the English language itself is changing from 52 to 89, so we want to use more important phrases. And then there was this whole thing about the inclusive language, and the New Revised Standard Version maybe went a little too far on the inclusive language issue, because they would come to maybe a pronoun he, especially he, and they might translate it in plural as they, meaning everyone. And so they probably, in the new RSV updated edition, swung back a little bit the other way and corrected some of those maybe overstretches that the new RSV did. But then from 89 to 23, you know, there's more things we know about translations. There's more things we know about the Hebrew and the Greek, and so we want to put those in. And then there's just, we want it to be in everyday language. I think we picked up on this. We were dealing with something, was it in the Gospel of Luke? Paul, you might remember edema, the swelling, the disease of swelling. We were talking about that, and this used a different medical technical term than this one did. And I can't remember the specifics, but we did notice that, hey, they're in the updated version, they added some new medical technical language that maybe we probably had it in 89, but it wasn't as popular. So there's just a need, well, there just seems to be a need for translations to be. So I don't know what they're going to do here after this one, because RSV, new RSV updated version, maybe they'll just come up with a new title or something when this needs to be updated.
One little tidbit locally connected to the new Revised Standard Version is Bruce Metzger was in charge of that project of the new Revised
I
Standard
knew
Version.
Bruce.
He was born in Middletown and raised in Middletown,
I didn't know that.
local boy.
Bruce Metzger was a really good New Testament scholar out of Princeton. In fact, Randy Snyder, one of my teachers at Bethany, he studied under Bruce Metzger, Bruce M. Metzger, and he said, you know how students are, they always pick on that professor. Yeah, we just called him BM. But he was a good scholar. I got to hear him speak in Baltimore a couple years before he died. And Bruce Metzger, he has a nice book on the English translations. That would be a good book to pick up if you want to read more about this. And he doesn't cover all of them, but he covers some of the more popular ones. The last thing I want to do, and Joe, you got to help me with this one, is the English Standard Version.
Yes,
And I am seeing that being picked up. It used to be maybe in the 70s, evangelical churches were using the NIV. Would that be?
it came out in the,
NIV came out in 96.
well,
No.
but the English Standard Version came out when the Revised Standard Version was going to do the it was when the NIV wanted to do the NIRV or one of the other alternate
Okay.
NIVs where they were going to do some language modification for the gender and how to translate the pronouns. So,
Right.
and it was the group, conservative group that did not want to change the masculine nomenclature.
Yeah.
To a non-specific nomenclature. And this happened in the 80s or early 90s, and it was no focus on the family. It was really behind this, and some groups like that. They got together in Chicago and had a big meeting about coming up with a new product, and they got permission from the National Council of Churches to take the the original Revised Standard Version and tweak that. So the English Standard Version has a lot of similarity to the Revised Standard
Yes.
Version. And they just adjusted that a bit to meet their particular philosophical bent. So, and in some ways, the ESV is still part of the Tyndale tradition
Right.
Bibles.
But I'm seeing, you know, with people who I know who are in evangelical circles, they used to use the NIV and now they're using the ESV.
That's what, I was looking at this. I wanted to know when the NIV was published because it was really an evangelical response. And I thought, isn't that interesting, 78? Because that's when the religious right really started getting a voice. So I'm assuming the NIV was a response to that.
Could be, although we're looking at people like Falwell, they would have stuck with the King James. So some would have stuck with the King James, and then some who wanted a more readable translation in the evangelical circles went with NIV, which is not a bad translation. It does have some of the evangelical twist to it. But then we talked about that one Sunday a number of months ago, and the NIV came out with a newer edition in 2011. And I think that's what we have in our red Bibles we're using here in this class. It's the 2011 edition.
Richard Warren uses the NIV.
Okay, there you go. All right, we're going to shift. Hopefully this has been helpful. Any questions? You know, it gets complicated. I said that, I've been saying that. a lot.
Somewhere in the King James versions, wasn't there one called the Evil Bible? You familiar with that?
Oh, yeah.
I am not, Joe.
Thou shalt commit adultery. Yeah,
I'm sure I heard about it here.
Well,
It's in his Bible.
yeah,
Who?
That's Trump's.
Oh, yeah, right.
That's Trump's
Uh,
Bible.
but yeah, there was a printer's error. That
Oh,
was
yeah, I know about that.
Yeah.
Oh, sure, error.
a printer's error.
And how many Bibles did they print?
That's very valuable if you have.
Yeah.
There are collectors out there, and there was original, in Ruth, there was a phrase about going into the city, and I forget which is the right one, it's either he or she went into the city, and there was a printing, at first printing had the wrong he or she, forget which it was. So if you can get the 1611 misprint, that's probably the most valuable monetarily of the King James 1611
Yeah.
Bible.
Any other questions? We'll have more opportunity to talk about the different languages and so forth. Not languages, different translations. Right. There's a medal here. Okay, so it's making its way around, it's right out here.
So here's some more over here.
Okay, I'm coming.
But what? No, I'm trying to give it back in their extras.
Did you get that from John? Oh, okay, they have extra.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, what I did with this translation. My goal here is before we start talking about word for word translations and the different translations, because there's so many out there, we have found it helpful to categorize. Okay, these are word for word. These translations seem to be thought for thought. These are more of a balance of word for word and thought for thought. And these translations, not translations, but these Bibles are paraphrasing. It helps to put them in categories so we know what their goal, what the translator's goal was. But before we do that, we've had a lot of discussion in this class about footnotes. And I'm talking about annotating notes, and then we talk about, well, okay, what's the difference between footnotes and annotated notes? So I'm working with the SBL, Society of Biblical Literature Study Bible of the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. So this is what I bought last year. And so when we talk about annotated notes, we're talking about notes from a particular study Bible. And this is the study Bible put out by the Society of Biblical Literature. We also know that Westminster John Knox Press has put together the Westminster Study Bible of the new RSV updated edition. And I think Oxford's coming out with theirs, and there may be another one. Because I was using, for the New Revised Standard Version, I was using the Oxford Annotated Study Bible. And I used that since 1989. And I actually had to buy several copies. I would use them, and they fall apart. Gotta buy another. So I have, and I never threw those other ones out. They're all my shelf, and the binding's coming apart and everything, and I have them duct tape.
Yep.
So that's what happens. So you have in your hands a page 792, and it's Psalm 23, and on the upper right, and then in the left-hand column, they're finishing up Psalm 22, and then when Psalm 23 comes to an end, they start Psalm 24, and then go to the next page, 793, to finish out Psalm 24. So this is a page 792 out of this Bible. And you see that black line toward the end, toward the bottom. Above that is the translation. And then in the right-hand column of that translation, you have footnotes at the end. Then you have that line across and study notes, annotated notes, whatever you want to call them, is below that line. So the footnotes are in the right-hand column above that line at the end, and then the annotated notes are at the bottom below the line. And what I want to do is, when you have a study Bible and you're not quite sure how it's organized or what's going on, go to the preface. It may take a while for you to find what you want, but it's there. It should be there. So I'm going to start reading textual notes. And this is the preface of this new study Bible. The textual notes are included at the bottom of the right-hand column of the translation. I've explained to you where they are. These notes were written by the New Revised Standard Version updated edition editors and signal textual difficulties. And what they mean by that is differences in the manuscripts or the other texts they're using, or alternate readings. And what they mean by that is we might agree on what Hebrew or Greek word needs to be translated, but we might not agree on how to translate it. So there are two different types of notes. There's textual notes that have to do, well, the Hebrew doesn't quite make sense, or the Greek doesn't make sense, so we might go to another manuscript or another edition to see if that works. Or, like I said, there's no question about the Greek or the Hebrew word, it's just how we want to translate that word. Then the next sentence reads, the reader will also find longer notes at the bottom of each page, and that's under that black line. These study notes, which were written by leading biblical scholars, provide historical and literary contexts, and they highlight similarities between different biblical texts. Now, that's not a lot of information, but that's a very brief explanation of the differences here. So let's work at this. Let's go to Psalm 23, verse 2. And I want you to find, well, actually, I have it circled for you, so you don't have to find it. You see the K that's circled. You know what a superscript is? Okay. Superscript is, now what's the word here? Water, it's a waters plural. And superscript means it's above. So you have the K, it's not here with the S, but it's above, that's a superscript. Subscript, I think, would be below. So this just has to do with fonts and types and how you're gonna do things. So your footnote, and most translations are gonna have this. Your footnote is gonna be just a little bit above, and they might start from A to Z, and then some get into AA or BB, and then some translations will just have footnotes A to whatever on one page, and then when you get to the next page, they start all over with A, and that could be helpful too. So now what we need to do is go down to those footnotes at the right-hand column, at the end of the column, and you see that little line, probably 12 spaces, and then it goes down. And then the footnotes are under that little line. What does K say? Hebrew waters of rest. Well, read K, yeah, it says that, and then it says 23:2. Right? 23:2, and then it says Hebrew waters of rest. So what that translation is saying, actually still waters, this comes from the King James Version. And they're saying that the Hebrew, as we look at that, as we play around with it, that really means waters of rest. It has waters in the plural, it's in a construct form, and then it has rest or resting. And one of the reasons, and most translations, newer translations, have that in some shape or form, a translation that reads restful waters or waters of rest. And one of the reasons is that still waters can indicate stagnant waters. I don't think it meant that when King James, bless you, translated it. But so, and when you read the Hebrew, waters of rest is really what it's saying. So
1611, same footnote, but they said waters of quietness.
Really?
Really?
Okay. Waters of quietness, yeah, and that would work. Because waters of quietness, I don't think would, well, it's closer to the Hebrew anyway. Still waters, it's not in my opinion. But that Hebrew word, nuach, it means restful quietness. And so waters of restfulness, waters of rest, waters of quietness. So.
Does one have an implication of the type of water and the other, how a person feels? Decided.
What do you mean one and the other? Still water?
Still waters would describe the water.
Yeah,
Rest would describe the observer. Is that a fair distinction?
you mean the observer of the water?
How they're describing water, for some reason, they weren't happy with still waters, I don't know why. I have to go back to a Tyndale had on that. And they put in the margin beside it, waters of quietnessa.
Yeah.
They had a different spelling.
Yeah, well, I would say they're both describing the water. When you think of, and we talked about this in seminary, and still waters can apply to stagnant waters, but if it's waters in a lake, or if it's waters in a stream, I mean, waters have to be moving. If you're in a stagnant pool, a pool of stagnant water, that's not good. You don't want to drink from that.
Is there a Hebrew term for stagnant water other than what's used for this?
I'm not aware.
I mean, I can distinctly remember hearing this, and the preacher said, don't drink by rushing water,
Yep.
they want still water, drink from
Uh-huh.
still water.
Because their nostrils are so close to their mouth.
Right.
I
You know,
remember this.
Yes, I have heard the same
Yeah.
thing.
Okay, so what we're talking about is the difference between a, some water coming down with white rapids and stuff like that. Yeah, you're not gonna, sheep aren't gonna drink from that. But, you can think about a quiet stream or a lake, where the water is restful, it's slow, it's still moving. I mean, the water has to move. If it doesn't move, then it becomes stagnant. Now, you might not be able to see it moving, but it's still moving. Because there's an inlet and an outlet to a lake.
Well, kind of following up on what Sharon said, still waters to me describes the character of the water. Waters of quietness or waters of rest describes the effect of the waters upon the observer.
Okay. Yeah. You can. And and the good thing about this, Sharon's comment and then Jim bringing it back up is you can see how you come to a text, different people are going to come up with different wording or different
Just there.
translation.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had here, Sharon brought it up and I'm saying, well, and Joe too saying, well, we're still describing the water. And Sharon and Jim, they want to bring the observer. Not so much more as I would, but that doesn't mean, just because I'm standing here, doesn't mean I'm right.
I wasn't advocating one versus the other,
Right,
just how you translate it says different things to me.
yes. Sure. Thank you for that.
But that's kind of the point, translation do mean different things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so you would come to that and say, well, we
Yeah,
need to bring the observer in. Or at least that's the difference you see between the two.
In the Wycliffe Psalms, it's water of refreshing.
That might be stretching the Hebrew a little bit, but it's making a point. Okay, let's go to the next one. What's the one I have circled? It's L. And again, the superscript, it's above. This L is above the L of soul. You can't really see that because the marker, my pen is in that in the way there. But so now you go down to L and there it is, 23:3, and it says or life. So if you look at the Hebrew here, it can mean soul. This is the Hebrew word nephesh. It can mean soul. It can mean life. It can mean flesh. So he restores my soul. In a lot of cases, it does mean life, but he leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. And we've heard that thousands, maybe millions of times. It has a poetic flavor to it, especially since we heard it so often. And, but the translators, they, in this translation, they stuck with soul. They wanted to preserve, they, you know, they still want to preserve that, even though this is the new RSV updated edition, still want to preserve what the King James had here, but they can't let that go. So they say, that this word can also mean like, your life. And I think they want to distinguish between soul as opposed to the afterlife as opposed to life now here on this earth.
Geneva Bible had still waters.
Okay,
I've got to go back to check Great Bible and Coverdale.
right. Okay. So we're kind of getting there. So you can already see, if we go back to the English translations from 1382 to the King James Version, and Joe's doing this work for us. Tyndale, he's looking up what the Tyndale said, what Stillwater, what Wycliffe Bible said, and what's some of the others. Even then, you're talking about several hundred years going on there. There were different ideas floating around, and people were borrowing phrases from earlier translations.
Got it. The order of King James was to use the bishop's Bible as your official starting point.
Okay,
The bishop's Bible had calm waters. The Geneva Bible is post-bishop's Bible, so the still waters is one of the Geneva Bible phrases
Okay.
included.
and that's probably why the King James went with,
Still waters.
no, well, yeah, oh no, the 1611
Yeah,
went differently than.
yeah, 1611 was the still waters. The Geneva was still waters in the bishop's Bible, which was supposed to be the reference for the King James, calm waters.
Okay. Okay, we don't, I'm gonna pick up, well, okay. Have we looked at, have we achieved our objective? What we just went through, do you understand the difference between footnotes and annotated notes? Now, if you look down, we just have 2 minutes, but if you look down at the notes on Psalm 23, below the black line, Psalm 23, it's a song of trust that may have been evoked by an experience of deliverance such as the one described in Psalm 22, the previous song. So it gives you just a sentence of description of the song itself. Then it starts getting into verse by verse or clusters of verses. So it talks about the imagery in Psalm 23 verses 1 to 3. And then it talks about the darkest valley. And I was going to explain that, but we don't have time to do that. And then it talks about 25 and then about verse 5 and verse 6. So you have footnotes and then you have annotated.
Is there a commonly used term for like the sidebar comments, like in the Baptist publication of the?
Well, the Anabaptist comments might be annotated notes, it's just they're on the side. It's
No, they're comment, but it's much broader commentary than you actually find in annotations. It's.
Some publishers call them excurses.
But sidebar too, the excurses here, wanna read. And then we can break. Where was that? The SBL Study Bible also includes numerous images and sidebars that provide cultural information and discuss different ways, passages, different ways that passages have been understood throughout history. Many of the sidebars come from a website by the Society of Biblical Literature called Bible Odyssey and so forth. So yeah, if you go through here, there'll be maps, there'll be photographs, and all those are put together by scholars that have been appointed by the publisher. And there will be an introduction to, in this study Bible and most study Bibles. If you come to the book of Joshua, for example, there's an introduction to Joshua. It says name and canonical context, authorship and date. And again, they can't give you a full text or a long essay on that, but they give you something and then some things on it, and then there's a section about distinctive features of the book of Joshua. And they give you all that information before you start reading getting into the actual text. So different study Bibles are going to offer different things. Okay. Next time we'll get on to the different translations.